The chandelier cast a warm golden glow over our mahogany dining table, the same table where we'd celebrated countless birthdays, anniversaries, and milestones over the past 4 decades. At 65, I thought I knew every shadow and secret in our colonial home. I was wrong. It was a crisp October evening when our son Daniel arrived with his wife Vivian for what should have been a joyous family dinner. Daniel, at 40, still had that earnest smile that had charmed teachers and neighbors since he was a boy. His dark hair was now touched with silver at the temples, and the stress lines around his eyes spoke of long hours at his architecture firm. Vivian glided in behind him, her auburn hair perfectly styled, wearing a cream-colored dress that flattered her slender figure. At 32, she possessed the kind of polished beauty that turned heads at charity galas and country club events. She'd been part of our family for 2 years now, though I'd always felt there was something calculating behind her warm smiles. "Beatrice, everything smells divine," Vivian said, kissing my cheek with practiced affection. "You've outdone yourself again." "Just a simple roast," I replied, though I'd spent the afternoon preparing Daniel's favorite meal. Harrison helped with the wine selection. My husband of 43 years emerged from his study, adjusting his reading glasses. Harrison had aged gracefully, his silver hair still thick, his blue eyes still sharp with intelligence. At 72, he maintained the bearing of the successful engineer he'd once been, though retirement had softened some of his edges. "The Cabernet should pair beautifully with the beef," Harrison said, embracing Daniel with genuine warmth. "How's the Morrison project coming along?" "Challenging, but we're making progress," Daniel replied. "The client keeps changing specifications, but that's architecture for you." We settled around the table, the familiar ritual of family dinner unfolding with comfortable precision. I'd set out my grandmother's china, the good crystal glasses catching the light like tiny prisms. The silver had been polished until it gleamed, and fresh flowers from Harrison's garden provided a centerpiece of autumn colors. "This reminds me of when Daniel was little," I said, serving the roast. "Remember how he used to build elaborate cities with his mashed potatoes? And you'd get so upset when I knocked down his buildings to eat." Harrison chuckled. Daniel laughed, the sound genuine and free. I was very serious about my potato architecture. Throughout the first course, I noticed Vivian seemed unusually radiant. She kept touching her stomach in absent protective gestures, and there was something triumphant in her expression. When she caught me watching, she'd smile that perfect smile, but her green eyes held secrets. "Actually," Vivian said suddenly, setting down her fork with deliberate precision, "we have some wonderful news to share." Daniel's face lit up with anticipation. He reached for his wife's hand, his love so evident it made my heart ache with recognition. I'd seen that same expression on Harrison's face decades ago. "We're going to have a baby," Vivian announced, her voice carrying just the right note of shy excitement. The words should have filled me with joy. I should have been crying happy tears, rushing to embrace my daughter-in-law, already planning nursery colors and baby showers. Instead, something cold settled in my stomach as I watched Vivian's eyes over Daniel's shoulder as he swept her into his arms. "That's wonderful," Daniel exclaimed, spinning her around. "Mom, Dad, you're going to be grandparents." Harrison's fork clattered against his plate, unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. When I looked at him, his face had gone pale, and he was staring at his hands with the expression of a man who'd just received devastating news. "Congratulations, sweetheart," I managed, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "When are you due?" "Early June," Vivian replied. "We're still processing it ourselves." Daniel was already talking about cribs and college funds, his happiness so pure it was almost painful to witness. He poured champagne for a toast, bubbling with plans and dreams for their growing family. Through it all, Vivian watched Harrison with a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. As Daniel raised his glass, Vivian stood and walked around the table toward me. I expected a congratulatory embrace, the kind of moment that would be photographed and treasured. Instead, she leaned down as if to whisper something sweet, and her lips brushed my ear. "You know, don't you," she murmured, her voice so low only I could hear, "Harrison has been very attentive to me lately, very caring." The words hit me like ice water. My hands gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles went white, but somehow I managed to maintain my composure. Years of hosting dinner parties and managing social situations had taught me to smile even when the world was crumbling around me. "How lovely," I heard myself say, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Vivian pulled back, studying my face with predatory interest. She'd expected tears, accusations, drama. My calm response had thrown her off balance, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was already planning her next move. "To new beginnings," Daniel called out, raising his champagne flute high. "To family," Harrison added quietly, his voice hoarse. I raised my own glass with a steady hand, smiled at my son, and felt my carefully ordered world begin to fracture around me. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of automatic responses and practiced smiles. I played the part of the delighted grandmother-to-be while inside. I was screaming. When they finally left, Daniel chattering excitedly about baby names and Vivian shooting me one last meaningful look. I stood in my kitchen loading the dishwasher with mechanical precision. The familiar domestic ritual felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Harrison appeared in the doorway, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "Beatrice, we need to talk." "Not tonight," I said without turning around. "I can't do this tonight." I heard him sigh, heard his footsteps retreat up the stairs to the bedroom we'd shared for over 4 decades. But I couldn't follow him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of what had been my last innocent family dinner, wondering how long I'd been living with strangers. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in our king-sized bed, listening to Harrison's breathing beside me, wondering if the man I'd shared my life with had become a stranger. Every small sound seemed amplified. The creak of the house settling, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the antique clock on Harrison's nightstand. When morning came, I moved through my routine like an actress playing a familiar role. Coffee for 2? Whole wheat toast cut diagonally the way Harrison preferred, eggs over easy with just a touch of pepper. We sat across from each other at our small breakfast table, the morning sun streaming through the lace curtains I'd hung 20 years ago. "Sleep well?" Harrison asked, not looking up from his newspaper. "Fine," I lied, studying his profile. At 72, he was still handsome in that distinguished way that had first caught my attention at a university mixer 45 years ago. But now I noticed things I'd overlooked. The tension in his jaw, the way his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "I'll be working in the garden today," he said, folding his paper with more force than necessary. "The roses need attention before the first frost." I watched him walk away, noting the slight stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there a year ago. Working in the garden, how many times had he used that excuse over the past few months? How many conversations had I missed while he was supposedly tending to his beloved roses? After Harrison left, I sat alone with my cooling coffee and let my mind drift back over recent months, searching for clues I might have missed. They were there, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too trusting to assemble. 2 months ago, I'd found a credit card statement with charges I didn't recognize. Romano's Jewelry, $850. Bella Vista Florist, $340. When I'd asked Harrison about them, he'd said he was planning surprises. "Your birthday's coming up," he'd said with a smile that now seemed forced in memory. 6 weeks ago, Vivian had started dropping by more frequently. always when Daniel was at work, always with some excuse about wanting to learn family recipes or asking for advice about marriage. She would stay for hours, and I'd often find her and Harrison having quiet conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. "Just discussing the garden," Harrison would say. "Vivian's interested in learning about roses." But Vivian had never shown interest in gardening before. In fact, she'd once complained that dirt under her fingernails made her feel absolutely primitive. Now, sitting in the harsh light of morning after, those conversations took on a sinister meaning. The way Vivian would touch Harrison's arm while they talked, the way she would laugh at things that weren't particularly funny, the way Harrison's cheeks would flush pink in a way I hadn't seen in years. I'd attributed it to harmless vanity, natural for a man his age to enjoy the attention of a young, beautiful woman. How naive I'd been. The phone rang, jarring me from my dark thoughts. Daniel's voice was bright with excitement. "Mom, did you sleep at all last night? I was too excited to close my eyes. We're going to start looking at cribs this weekend." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said carefully. "Vivian's already making lists, baby names, nursery themes, everything. She mentioned that Dad seemed really emotional about the news last night, said he got tears in his eyes when she told him privately." My hand tightened on the phone. "When did she tell him?" "Last week, I think. She wanted to share it with him first. Said she was nervous about how you'd both react. Isn't that sweet?" Last week, Vivian had told Harrison about the pregnancy a full week before announcing it to the family. Why would she do that unless... "Mom, you still there?" "Yes, just thinking about everything we'll need to prepare." After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. But I needed more than suspicions. I needed proof. I spent the rest of the morning mechanically cleaning rooms that were already spotless, folding laundry that didn't need to be folded. Through the kitchen window, I could see Harrison in his garden, pruning roses with practiced movements. Miguel Santos, our gardener, worked nearby, trimming hedges with quiet efficiency. Miguel was a gentle soul in his mid-30s, with kind brown eyes and work-roughened hands. He lived in a small apartment above the Martinez family's garage next door, taking care of several properties in our neighborhood. Harrison had hired him 6 months ago after our previous gardener retired, and I'd grown fond of his polite manner and dedication to making our yard beautiful. Now I watched him work and wondered what he'd seen, what he knew about the changes in my household. Around noon, Vivian's silver BMW pulled into our driveway. She emerged wearing designer jeans and a silk blouse, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she walked toward the garden where Harrison was working. I watched from behind the sheer curtains in our living room, my heart pounding with dread and anticipation. Their conversation was animated, Vivian's hands gesturing expressively while Harrison nodded. At one point, she placed her hand on his arm, that same gesture I'd noticed before but dismissed as friendliness. Now it looked like possession. When she laughed, throwing her head back in that practiced way, Harrison smiled, really smiled, in a way I hadn't seen in months. They talked for 20 minutes before Vivian glanced toward the house. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing with the absurd fear of being caught spying on my own husband. When I looked again, she was walking back to her car. But something had changed. Harrison remained in the garden, but his movements seemed lighter, like their conversation had lifted some burden from his shoulders. That evening, Harrison was almost cheerful at dinner. He talked about the garden, about plans for next spring, about how excited he was to be a grandfather. He was more animated than he'd been in weeks, and I found myself studying his face, searching for signs of guilt or deception. "Vivian stopped by today," I said carefully. "Yes." Harrison nodded, cutting his pork chop with steady hands. "Sweet girl. She's nervous about the pregnancy. Wanted some reassurance." What kind of reassurance? For just a moment, his knife stilled. Oh, first-time mother worries. Whether she'll be good at it, whether the baby will be healthy, normal concerns. But nothing about Vivian had ever struck me as normal, and I was beginning to suspect that this pregnancy was the least normal thing of all. Over the weekend, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't live with uncertainty anymore. Couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering if every smile was a lie, every kiss a betrayal. I was going to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Monday morning, after Harrison left for his weekly appointment with his cardiologist, I climbed the stairs to his study. The heavy oak door creaked as I pushed it open, and I felt like an intruder in my own home. The room smelled of his aftershave and the faint mustiness of old books. I started with his desk, my hands trembling as I opened the top drawer. Pens, paper clips, business cards, nothing unusual. The second drawer held bills and correspondence, all seemingly innocent. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of gardening magazines, I found something that made my breath catch: bank statements. Not from our joint account, but from a separate checking account I didn't know existed. The statements went back 6 months, and as I scanned the entries, my confusion deepened. There were regular deposits, $3,000, $400, $500, $5,000, appearing monthly, and corresponding withdrawals, always in cash, always in round numbers. Where was this money coming from, and where was it going? I photographed the statements with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to take several shots to get clear images. Then I carefully returned everything to its place and closed the drawer. The sound of a car in the driveway sent me scurrying to the window. Not Harrison's sedan, but Vivian's BMW. I watched her emerge and head not toward the front door, but around the side of the house toward the back garden where Miguel was working. This was my chance. I slipped downstairs and positioned myself where I could see the garden through the kitchen window. Vivian was approaching Miguel, who looked up from his work with an expression I couldn't quite read. Their conversation was brief but intense. Miguel kept shaking his head while Vivian seemed to be insisting on something. At one point, she reached into her purse and pulled out what looked like an envelope. Miguel looked around nervously before taking it and shoving it into his jacket pocket. Money? She was giving him money. But why would Vivian be paying our gardener Harrison handled all household expenses, including Miguel's wages? Before I could process this fully, another car pulled into the driveway, Daniel's Honda. I watched my son get out and wave to his wife, who immediately broke away from Miguel and hurried toward him with a bright smile. "Surprise," I heard her call out as she threw her arms around him. "I was hoping to catch you for lunch." Daniel laughed, spinning her around. "What are you doing here? Beautiful?" "I wanted to check on something in the garden," she said smoothly. "You know how interested I've become in landscaping since we found out about the baby." It was perfectly reasonable, perfectly innocent. But I had seen the envelope, seen Miguel's nervous glances. This wasn't about gardening. That evening, I lay awake long after Harrison had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together what I'd witnessed. The secret bank account, the envelope of money, the private conversations. None of it made sense if this was simply about an affair. But what if it wasn't about an affair at all? What if something much more complicated was happening under my nose? The investigation began in earnest the following morning. After Harrison left for what he claimed was a hardware store run, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. I was going to search through our personal papers, looking for answers to questions I was afraid to ask aloud. I started in Harrison's study, this time looking beyond the obvious hiding places. In a file cabinet I rarely accessed, I found folders labeled with names I didn't recognize: Morrison Development, Atlantic Consulting, Heritage Holdings. Each contained contracts and correspondence that made little sense to me, But the dollar amounts were significant, tens of thousands of dollars changing hands for consulting services that Harrison had never mentioned. My husband had been a respected structural engineer before retirement, but these documents suggested business dealings that went far beyond his expertise. Why hadn't he told me about this apparent consulting work? The sound of voices in our backyard interrupted my search. Through the study window, I could see Vivian and Miguel having another intense conversation near the tool shed. Even from a distance, I could tell Miguel was upset. His hands moved in agitated gestures, while Vivian stood with her arms crossed, her posture radiating authority. I crept downstairs and positioned myself where I could hear fragments of their conversation through the partially open kitchen window. "Can't keep doing this." Miguel's voice carried distress. "It's not right. Daniel doesn't deserve." "We've discussed this." Vivian's voice was sharp with warning. "You knew the terms when you agreed." "But the baby, is he? When it comes, people will know." "Let me worry about that. Your job is to keep quiet and do exactly what I tell you." I pressed closer to the window, straining to hear more, but their voices dropped to urgent whispers. Finally, Miguel threw his hands up in apparent frustration and stalked toward his truck. Vivian watched him go, her face set in hard lines that transformed her from the sweet young woman my son had married into someone I barely recognized. When Harrison returned an hour later, he seemed more withdrawn than before. He went straight to his study and closed the door. I could hear him making phone calls, his voice low and urgent, but I couldn't make out the words. That afternoon, while Harrison napped in his recliner, I did something I'd never done in 43 years of marriage. I went through his personal effects looking for secrets. In his sock drawer, beneath carefully folded argyle pears, I found a small key I didn't recognize. The key fit a lockbox hidden behind books on his study shelf. Inside, I discovered documents that made my blood run cold. Loan applications in Daniel's name for amounts that would cripple his finances, credit cards I'd never heard him mention, and at the bottom, a handwritten note in Vivian's elegant script, Northwest Credit Union, $35,000, Chase personal loan, $22,000, emergency fund, $8,000, total exposure, $65,000. When my hand shook as I photographed everything, my mind racing to understand what I was seeing. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about money. Lots of money that my son apparently owed but couldn't possibly afford. A sound from downstairs made me freeze, the front door closing. I quickly returned everything to its place and crept to the window. Vivian's car was in the driveway, and she was walking toward the house with her usual confident stride. I made it downstairs just as she entered, using the key we'd given her after the wedding. "Beatrice," she called out, her voice bright with false cheer. "I hope you don't mind me letting myself in. I was hoping we could have a little chat." "Of course. Would you like some coffee?" "That would be lovely." I busied myself with the coffee maker, acutely aware of Vivian settling herself at my kitchen table like she owned the place. When I turned around, she was watching me with those sharp green eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. "You seem nervous," she observed, tilting her head. "Is everything all right?" "Just tired. Didn't sleep well." She took a delicate sip from her cup. "I imagine you have a lot on your mind. Pregnancies can be overwhelming, especially when they're unexpected." There was something in her tone that made me study her face more carefully. She looked different today, harder somehow, like she'd dropped some of the sweet young wife act she usually wore around me. "Vivian," I said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you tell Harrison about the pregnancy before you told Daniel?" Her cup paused halfway to her lips. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise? Maybe. Or calculation. Then the smile returned. "I was nervous," she said smoothly. I wanted to make sure the family would be supportive before I told my husband. Harrison has always been so kind to me. Kind, very kind, protective, even... She set down her cup and leaned forward. He's been so worried about me lately. Has he mentioned that I've been having some difficulties? What kind of difficulties? Oh, just some stress, financial pressures. Her eyes never left mine. You know how it is when you're young and trying to establish yourself. Sometimes you make choices that seem reasonable at the time but become complicated later. I felt like I was walking through a minefield. What kind of choices? Vivian laughed, but there was no warmth in it. The kind that require understanding family members, the kind that require discretion. She paused, studying my face. The kind that your husband has been so helpful with. My chest tightened. I don't understand. Don't you... She stood up, moving to the window that looked out on the garden. Harrison is such a good man, such a devoted father. He'd do anything to protect his family, wouldn't he? Even if it meant sacrificing his own reputation. The words hung in the air like poison. I stared at her back, at the casual way she surveyed my garden like she was evaluating real estate. What are you saying? I whispered. She turned around, and the mask was completely gone now. What I saw in her face was cold calculation, the expression of someone who held all the cards and knew it. I'm saying that some secrets are more valuable than others, Beatrice, and some people will pay dearly to keep those secrets buried. Before I could respond, the sound of voices outside caught our attention. Through the window, I could see Harrison and Miguel having what looked like an intense conversation near the tool shed. Harrison was gesturing emphatically while Miguel kept shaking his head. Vivian's face changed, a flash of something that might have been panic crossing her features. "Excuse me," she said quickly, heading for the back door. "I need to speak with them." I followed her outside, staying close enough to hear but trying to appear casual. The conversation stopped abruptly when Vivian approached, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. "Is everything all right?" Vivian asked, but her voice was sharp with warning. Miguel looked between Harrison and Vivian, his face troubled. "I can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "This isn't right. Daniel's a good man. He doesn't deserve this." "Miguel." Vivian's voice was ice cold. "We've discussed this." "You've discussed what?" I asked, stepping closer. The three of them turned to look at me, and I saw guilt written across all their faces, though in very different ways. Miguel looked sick with remorse. Vivian looked angry at being interrupted, and Harrison looked like a man who had been carrying a terrible burden for too long. "Beatrice," Harrison said, his voice breaking. I shouldn't what? Stand in my own backyard." I kept my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "What exactly have you all discussed that I shouldn't hear?" Silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of autumn leaves rustling in the breeze. Finally, Miguel spoke. "I can't do this anymore," he said, looking directly at me. "Mrs. Langley, there are things you need to know. Things about—" "That's enough." Vivian snapped. "Miguel, we had an agreement." "What agreement?" I demanded. Miguel looked at Harrison, something pleading in his expression. "Tell her," he said. "She deserves to know what's really happening." Harrison closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were filled with a pain so deep it took my breath away. "Beatrice," he whispered, "I never wanted you to find out this way." "Find out what?" But even as I asked, pieces were clicking together in my mind. The bank statements, the mysterious errands, Vivian's veiled threats about secrets and protection. "It's not what you think," Harrison said urgently. "It's not what she wants you to think." Vivian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but it is exactly what she thinks, isn't it? Beatrice, your devoted husband, carrying on with his son's wife, such a cliché." I stared at my husband, searching his face for truth. "Harrison, I'm not having an affair," he said, his voice breaking. "Beatrice, I would never, He stopped, looking helplessly at Vivian. "But I can't explain without what?" I pressed. "Without destroying our son's life." Vivian finished for him, her smile triumphant. "You see, Beatrice, your husband loves Daniel too much to tell him the truth. About his wife. About what I know. About what Daniel's been doing." The world seemed to tilt around me. "What has Daniel been doing?" Miguel stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "About the gambling," he said quietly. "About the debts. About the accounts she made him open. The loans she convinced him to take out." "Miguel!" Vivian warned. But Miguel continued, the words pouring out like he'd been holding them back for months. "She's been blackmailing Mr. Langley, threatening to destroy Daniel if he doesn't cooperate with her lies, making him pretend there's something between them to cover up what she's really been doing." My legs nearly gave out. I grabbed the fence post for support, staring at the three faces in front of me. Gambling debts. Harrison nodded miserably. Online poker. Sports betting. It started small, but... He spread his hands helplessly. "He owes over $75,000, Beatrice, to dangerous people. And she knows," Miguel said, his voice thick with disgust. "She's the one who got him into it, introduced him to the sites, encouraged him to bet bigger. Then when he was in too deep, she offered to help. For a price." I looked at Vivian, who was watching this revelation with something that might have been amusement. "What price?" "Silence," she said simply. "Cooperation. A marriage that gives me access to your family's resources." Her hand moved to her stomach. "And insurance for the future." "The baby," I whispered, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "It's not Daniel's." "Very good," Vivian said, clapping her hands slowly. "I was wondering when you'd figure that out." Miguel stepped forward, his eyes filled with shame. "It's mine," he said quietly. "The baby is mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my marriage, about the past few months was crumbling like sand. The confrontation in the garden left me feeling like I'd been hit by a freight train. I sat in my living room for what felt like hours after they all left, Vivian with her cold satisfaction, Miguel with his guilt-ridden shame, and Harrison with his devastating relief at finally telling the truth. My son was drowning in gambling debt. My husband was being blackmailed. My daughter-in-law was a calculating manipulator who was pregnant with our gardener's child. And somehow, I was supposed to figure out how to handle this without destroying everyone I loved. Over the next few days, Harrison and I had the most difficult conversations of our 43-year marriage. Slowly, painfully, the full scope of the situation emerged. Daniel's gambling addiction had started innocently enough, office poker games that gradually escalated to online betting. Vivian, who handled their finances as an accountant, had noticed the losses and initially seemed supportive. She was so understanding, Harrison told me as we sat in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his secret financial maneuvering. She told Daniel she'd help him manage the debt, consolidate the loans, but instead, she was orchestrating it all. The loans I'd found weren't random acts of desperation. They were part of Vivian's carefully constructed plan. She'd guided Daniel to take out personal loans, open credit lines, even convinced him to mortgage their condo. Each step had been presented as a solution to the previous problem, but the debt had only grown larger. "When did she approach you?" I asked. Harrison's face aged 10 years as he remembered. 3 months ago. She came to me in tears, said Daniel was in serious trouble, said there were people who might hurt him if he didn't pay. She showed me documents, phone records of threats, He rubbed his temples. I couldn't let anything happen to him, Beatrice. He's our son. He's our... So Harrison had begun liquidating investments, taking out a line of credit against our home. Anything to keep Daniel safe. But it was never enough. Each payment only bought temporary relief before Vivian would return with news of new debts, new threats. The affair story was her idea. Harrison continued. She said people might ask questions about why I was helping them financially. If they thought I was involved with her, it would explain the money transfers, protect Daniel's reputation. And you believed her. I was desperate. Daniel looked so broken, so ashamed. I thought if I could just fix this quietly, he'd never have to know how bad it had gotten. But Vivian's plan was more sophisticated than simple blackmail. She'd been systematically isolating Daniel from his support systems, convincing him that his gambling was too shameful to share with family. Meanwhile, she'd positioned herself as his savior, the only person who understood and could help. The pregnancy announcement had been the final piece of her puzzle. With a baby on the way, she'd have permanent ties to our family and our resources. The implied affair with Harrison provided cover for when the child was born and didn't resemble Daniel. "What about Miguel?" I asked. Harrison sighed heavily. "I don't think he was part of her original plan. From what I can tell, she seduced him out of loneliness or boredom. When she got pregnant, she saw an opportunity to use him too." The money she'd been giving Miguel wasn't payment for services. It was hush money. She'd convinced him that if the truth came out, he'd be blamed for seducing a married woman, possibly lose his job and his immigration status. As the pieces fell into place, I felt a mixture of rage and determination building inside me. Vivian had played us all like chess pieces, manipulating our love for Daniel and each other to serve her own agenda, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me. "We need proof," I told Harrison. "Real evidence that will hold up if this goes to court." "Court." "Harrison, she's committed fraud, extortion, possibly identity theft with those loans in Daniel's name. This isn't just a family matter anymore." I called Amanda Torres, my neighbor who worked as a paralegal for one of the city's top law firms. Without giving away too many details, I asked her to recommend a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. Detective Sarah Chen was a former police officer who now ran her own investigation service. She was professional, discreet, and after hearing our story, determined to help us build a case against Vivian. "This type of financial manipulation is more common than you'd think," Detective Chen told us during our first meeting. "The pregnancy complicates things, but if she's been forging documents or coercing your son into financial decisions, we can build a strong case." Over the next week, Detective Chen worked to trace the paper trail of Daniel's debts. What she found was even worse than we'd imagined. Several of the loans had been taken out using forged documents. The threatening phone calls Harrison had heard about were traced back to a burner phone registered under a false name, a phone that had been purchased with one of Vivian's credit cards. She created the crisis and then sold herself as the solution, Detective Chen explained. "It's a sophisticated con game." But we still needed definitive proof about the pregnancy. As much as it pained me to invade Daniel's privacy further, I knew we had to establish paternity before confronting him with the truth. Miguel, consumed with guilt over his role in the deception, agreed to provide a DNA sample for testing. Through Detective Chen's contacts at a private lab, we were able to arrange for a paternity test using advanced techniques that could analyze fetal DNA from a simple blood sample from Vivian. "How do we get Vivian to provide blood for testing?" I asked. Detective Chen smiled grimly. "Leave that to me." She arranged for Vivian to receive a call from someone claiming to be from her doctor's office, saying there had been an issue with her recent blood work and she needed to come in for additional testing. Vivian, not wanting to risk any complications with her pregnancy, complied immediately. The results came back within days. Miguel Santos was indeed the biological father of Vivian's unborn child. The probability of paternity was 99.7%. Armed with this evidence, along with the financial documents Detective Chen had compiled. We had everything we needed to expose Vivian's deception. But I wanted to handle this carefully. Daniel's emotional well-being was still my primary concern. We need to tell him before we take any legal action. I told Harrison. He deserves to hear the truth from us, not from a lawyer or detective. Harrison nodded, though I could see the fear in his eyes. What if this destroys him? What if he can't handle knowing how badly he was manipulated? Then we'll help him through it, I said firmly. But living with lies has nearly destroyed our family. It's time for the truth, no matter how painful. That evening, I called Daniel and asked him to come over for dinner the next night, just the three of us, without Vivian. He seemed puzzled by the request, but agreed. Is everything okay? Mom, you sound serious. We just need to talk. Sweetheart, family matters. As I hung up the phone, I felt the weight of what we were about to do. Tomorrow night, we would shatter my son's world. But maybe, just maybe, we could help him build something better from the pieces. The next evening arrived gray and drizzling, matching the somber mood that had settled over our house. I spent the afternoon preparing Daniel's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, homemade rolls, and apple pie from my grandmother's recipe. The familiar rituals of cooking provided a small comfort as I steeled myself for what was to come. Harrison paced nervously between his study and the living room, checking and rechecking the documents Detective Chen had prepared. We'd organized everything methodically: the financial records, the DNA test results, the evidence of Vivian's manipulation. It all painted a clear picture of systematic deception and fraud. Daniel arrived promptly at 6, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued by the serious tone of my invitation. He hugged me tightly, and I could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the stress sweat that had become his constant companion in recent months. "This smells incredible, Mom," he said, trying to inject normalcy into the tension-filled air. "But where's Vivian? I thought she was coming too." "She had other plans," I said carefully. "Tonight is just for family." We sat down to dinner, the three of us around the same table where Daniel had grown up, where we'd celebrated his graduations and achievements, where Vivian had announced her pregnancy just weeks before. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel tried to maintain conversation, talking about work projects and asking about Harrison's garden, but I could see the questions building behind his eyes. He knew something was wrong. Finally. As I served dessert, Harrison cleared his throat. "Son, there are some things we need to discuss. About Vivian, about your finances, about what's been happening in this family." Daniel's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" I reached across the table and took his hand. "Daniel, we know about the gambling. We know about the debts." The color drained from his face. Did Vivian tell you?" "In a way, yes," Harrison said quietly. "But not the way you think." Over the next hour, we laid out everything we'd discovered. We showed him the loan documents with forged signatures, the evidence of Vivian's manipulation, the proof that she'd created many of the threatening situations she claimed to be protecting him from. Daniel listened in stunned silence, his face cycling through disbelief, shame, and finally, a terrible recognition. "The baby," he whispered when we'd finished. The timing never quite made sense, but I pulled out the DNA test results and placed them gently in front of him. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. The baby isn't yours." Daniel stared at the clinical language that spelled out the truth in black and white. When he looked up, tears were streaming down his face. "Miguel," Harrison nodded. "She seduced him, then used his fear to keep him quiet. Just like she used your shame about the gambling to control you." "I feel so stupid," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. How could I not see what she was doing? Because you loved her, I said simply, and love makes us vulnerable. She knew exactly how to use that against you. Daniel was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of what he'd learned. Finally, he looked up at us with red-rimmed eyes. What happens now? That's up to you. Harrison said, Detective Chen says we have enough evidence to press charges for fraud, identity theft, and extortion. But we wanted to talk to you first. Daniel nodded slowly. I want to confront her. I need to hear her admit what she's done. Are you sure? I asked. She's very skilled at manipulation. She might try to twist this around, make you doubt what you know to be true. I have to try. Mom, I need to understand how I got so lost. We arranged for the confrontation to take place in our living room the next evening. Detective Chen would be present, recording everything for potential legal proceedings. Vivian arrived expecting a normal family dinner, but her expression shifted the moment she saw the serious faces waiting for her. What's going on? She asked, her voice carefully controlled. Daniel stood in the center of the room, holding the DNA test results. I know, he said simply. I know about the gambling sites you introduced me to. I know about the fake loan documents. I know about Miguel. For just a moment, Vivian's mask slipped completely. I saw panic, calculation, and then resignation flicker across her features. She looked around the room, taking in Detective Chen with her recording equipment, the documents spread across the coffee table, our unified front against her. You don't understand, she said finally. I was trying to help you. You were in over your head, and You created the crisis, Daniel interrupted. You encouraged me to bet more, introduced me to higher stakes games, then swooped in as my savior when I was drowning. Vivian's shoulders sagged as she realized the game was over. The baby, she said quietly. What about the baby? Miguel's been in contact with a family law attorney, I said. He wants to be involved in the child's life, provide support. You won't be alone. And legally, she asked Detective Chen, that depends on several factors. The detective replied, your cooperation with paying back the fraudulent loans, your willingness to sign divorce papers without contesting, and whether the family chooses to press criminal charges. Daniel looked at me and Harrison, then back at Vivian. I won't press charges if you agree to dissolve our marriage, repay what you can of the legitimate debts, and leave our family alone. The baby deserves a chance at a normal life, even if its mother doesn't. Vivian nodded, tears streaming down her face. Whether they were genuine or calculated, I couldn't tell anymore. 6 months later, I received a photo in the mail. A baby boy with dark hair and Miguel's gentle eyes. On the back, in Vivian's handwriting, David Miguel Santos, thank you for giving us both a second chance. Daniel had thrown himself into recovery, attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings and working with a therapist to understand how he'd become so vulnerable to manipulation. He'd met Sarah, a nurse at the clinic where he received counseling, and their relationship was building slowly on foundations of honesty and mutual respect. Harrison and I were closer than we'd been in years, our marriage strengthened by the truth we'd finally learned to share. We'd paid off Daniel's legitimate debts and helped him restructure his finances. But more importantly, we'd learned not to let shame silence us when family was at stake. Miguel had moved to Phoenix to be near his son, finding work with a landscaping company and slowly building a relationship with David. Vivian, to her credit, was allowing him full access and had enrolled in community college to study early childhood education. Sometimes the greatest victories are the quietest ones, not dramatic confrontations or public revelations, but the simple act of choosing truth over lies, forgiveness over revenge, and love over the fear of being hurt. I learned that at 65, it's never too late to fight for your family. And sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't anger or accusation, but the quiet dignity of a woman who knows her own worth and refuses to let anyone diminish it. In the end, I didn't destroy Vivian. I simply removed her power to destroy us. And that, I've discovered, makes all the difference in the world. As I write this, Daniel is planning to propose to Sarah next month. Harrison is teaching our future daughter-in-law how to tend his roses, and I'm preparing for grandchildren who will be raised with honesty, surrounded by a family that has learned the difference between keeping secrets and protecting love. The dinner that changed everything taught us that truth, however painful, is always preferable to the most beautiful lie. And family, real family, can survive anything when built on that foundation. And that's the story of Beatrice Langley, a woman who proved that true strength doesn't lie in shouting or dramatic confrontations, but in patience, wisdom, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. This story reminds us that family love sometimes requires difficult decisions, and sometimes protecting those we love means having the courage to expose lies, no matter how sweetly they're disguised. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this emotional journey with us. If Beatrice's story moved you, or if you learned something from her quest for truth, please let us know by hitting like. If you enjoyed this story, sharing, so your loved ones can also hear meaningful stories like this. Commenting to share your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Beatrice's situation, or have you ever experienced something similar? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss other touching stories we'll bring to you in the comments below. Please let us know what city you're watching from so we can see how far this story has reached. And if you have family stories full of surprises or difficult situations you'd like to share, don't hesitate to tell us about them. Every story carries valuable lessons about life, about love, and about human strength when facing adversity. See you in the next video with equally captivating and moving stories. Take care of yourselves, and remember, sometimes the most difficult challenges lead to the most beautiful endings. Have a wonderful day.